The scenario often cited as a coordinated effort surrounding the 2020 election is described in a widely discussed Time magazine article titled "The Secret History of the Shadow Campaign That Saved the 2020 Election." According to this article, a coalition of bipartisan leaders, corporations, labor unions, social justice activists, and influential figures worked together to fortify the election, aiming to ensure that it would proceed without interference and with what they viewed as a high level of integrity. Here's a closer look at the coalition and their activities based on public accounts and what has been interpreted by critics as a scenario involving careful coordination across various sectors. 1. Coalition partners and key players. Big tech companies. Social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter were involved, mainly in moderating content and controlling the spread of misinformation. Facebook's CEO, Mark Zuckerberg, and his wife, Priscilla Chan, donated millions of dollars to election integrity projects. These funds were intended to support local election offices in handling increased mail-in voting and providing more resources to ensure safe and secure elections during the pandemic. However, some argued this support favored certain voter bases. Media organizations, major media outlets played a significant role in shaping public narratives. For example, Time reported on how news platforms aimed to counteract misinformation and bolster public confidence in election results. Media organizations aligned with this effort are often seen as having played a role by controlling how information, such as the Hunter Biden laptop story, was reported or suppressed. Labor unions and grassroots organizations. Labor groups, such as the AFL-CIO and progressive organizations, helped to mobilize voters, especially in key swing states. This outreach often involved substantial efforts to ensure that communities with high Democratic turnout would participate in record numbers, including mail-in ballots. Legal advocacy and election lawyers. A group of prominent legal experts prepared for potential post-election disputes. Organizations like the Brennan Center for Justice and Democracy Docket, founded by Democratic lawyer Mark Elias, actively challenged what they saw as voter suppression tactics in court. They sought to protect mail-in voting and challenge restrictions they believed could disenfranchise voters. Corporations and CEOs, major corporations and influential business leaders publicly supported election integrity efforts, including some who pledged to keep their businesses closed on Election Day to encourage employees to vote. This coalition was seen as having a vested interest in political stability and public trust in the electoral process. Activists and social justice groups, civil rights groups, and progressive activists, such as the Movement for Black Lives and other organizations, were involved in voter mobilization campaigns. Their efforts aimed to increase turnout among historically marginalized communities. Some groups also planned protests and prepared responses in case there were perceived threats to a fair election outcome. 2. Objectives of the coalition. The coalition's efforts were driven by a few main objectives, which they viewed as necessary to fortify the election. Protecting election infrastructure. The coalition supported efforts to secure election systems, partly by directing resources to areas in need of additional polling support, personnel, and infrastructure. Countering misinformation. The coalition aimed to ensure voters were informed about the election and prevent the spread of what they identified as misleading narratives that could delegitimize the results. Social media platforms collaborated with election security officials to filter misinformation, a step that, critics argue, was used selectively and sometimes targeted narratives that might have harmed democratic interests. Legal preparedness. Lawyers prepared for potential litigation surrounding the election outcome, especially concerning mail-in ballots and extended voting deadlines. This preemptive approach aimed to defend access to mail-in ballots, which were expected to be more heavily used by Democrats due to COVID-19. Ensuring public acceptance of the results. The coalition worked to preemptively counter any potential challenges to the election's legitimacy by promoting public confidence and preparing to mobilize in the event of disputes. This effort involved widespread messaging that the election was secure and fair, regardless of who won. 3. Public reaction and criticisms. The Time article described this coalition as a shadow campaign that worked in unprecedented ways to influence election infrastructure and public perception. Supporters viewed the coalition's efforts as a safeguard against potential threats to democracy, emphasizing that its actions were public and bipartisan. Critics, however, interpret the coalition's activities as undue influence on the electoral process, arguing that the coordination between big tech, media, and other entities created a scenario that biased the election. For instance, the suppression of certain news stories, like those surrounding Hunter Biden, and the encouragement of mail-in voting were seen as strategically favorable to Democratic interests. 4. Interpretations of the scenario. The coalition described in the article was a broad network of influential players united by a shared goal of what they considered to be election security and integrity. The participants openly admitted their involvement in protecting the election process, but emphasized their intentions as transparent and lawful. In summary, the 2020 election scenario involved a coordinated effort by a diverse coalition that included big tech, media organizations, labor unions, and political activists. They worked to fortify the election through messaging, legal preparedness, and voter mobilization. Whether one views this effort as necessary election security or undue influence depends largely on one's perspective, with supporters claiming it defended democracy and critics suggesting it unfairly tilted the balance.